Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. Today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 21, and this is one of the significant passages because this passage is the culmination to the journey we've been on through the last number of passages. When we first met the central characters to this part of the narrative, we met a man named Abram and his wife Sarai. We saw how God called them out of Haran and how said, I want you to leave all that you know to go to a place that I will show you. And I am going to take you and I am going to bless you and I'm going to make you a blessing. I am going to multiply your offspring and I'm going to make you into a great nation. And everyone who blesses you, I will bless, and everyone who dishonors you, I will curse. And through your line, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But at the same time as we meet Abram and Sarai, and we hear this call from God, we also are told an important fact, that Sarai was barren and was unable to have children. And we begin to see the conflict because God's promise to Abraham, God's covenant with him, that he keeps growing and expanding. It becomes a grander and a grander covenant as God repeats it to him, even to the point of changing Abram's name from Exalted One to Abraham, the father of multitudes. There is constantly this physical obstacle. Sarai, whose name becomes Sarah, cannot have children. And so this becomes the challenge. There is the promise of God and there is the physical reality. The promise of God and the physical reality. And they are at odds. The promise versus reality. At one point, we see how Abram and Sarai seek to deal with this conflict by using human means. So Sarai goes to her husband and says, look, I can't have children. Your promise, everything is based on having offspring. I have a servant, Hagar. We're going to let Hagar become a surrogate. So Hagar will have a child with you, but as my servant. So officially it is like my child. And as you will be the father, this child will be your heir. And Abram agrees to this. And he has a child with Hagar, Ishmael. But the Lord comes and says, this is not the child that is tied to the covenant. I'll bless her child, but it's not the child tied to the covenant. So once again, we're still in the same problem. Because there is no heir. And during this time, Abraham continues to age. When Abraham is given the promise, he was 75. By the time we reach the point where we find ourselves now, Abraham is 100 years old. His wife, who could not have children in her earlier years, his wife is now in her 90s. And she has now entered into menopause. She is not physically, biologically able to conceive. She couldn't conceive when things were the way they should be biologically. Now she is past that. So, Abraham and Sarah. This is the challenge. The Lord has over and over again reestablished his promise. The Lord has appeared to him face to face in a theophany and established that promise. Within the year, you will have a son. Abraham laughed the first time he heard it in his old age. Sarah laughed when the Lord came face to face to say it to Abraham. The Lord said, you will have a child. What is going to happen between the promise and reality? Then we come to chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Notice the language here. So here is the promise, and this was the reality. And this is what we see. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said. The Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. The one who made the promise is the one who made it a reality. It's important, though, to note, and this is something that's significant here, this was not an immaculate conception. Abraham and Sarah physically coupled to produce a child. Abraham and Sarah still continued to have that physical relationship in order to have a child. But the Lord made it happen. The Lord made the promise the reality. So though it was Abraham and Sarah's physical child, physical relationship, we are told in this passage, and it's very significant, the wording, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. The Lord enabled her to conceive as he had promised, so that Sarah had a son for Abraham. Just as the Lord had said. This is that celebration point. All that we've heard going through 25 years of this promise, till it came to the point where it said, within the year you will have a child. And at that time, the exact time in the Lord's calendar, the Lord who gave the promise is the Lord who made it reality. So that Sarah had a son, as the Lord had promised, for Abraham. So Abraham has an heir. Abraham has an heir. Abraham, verse 3, called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him. Notice the wording there, just in case there's any ambiguity as to what's happened. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him. There's no question here what's happening. God promised him a son. Abraham has a son. Whose son is it? It's Abraham's son. Whose son is it? It's Sarah's son. Not through a surrogate, not through adoption, but through the means the Lord had promised. This man and this woman had the child of promise. And they named him Isaac. They named him Isaac, which means laughter. The laughter that was A laughter of derision before is now the laughter of joy. Imagine Sarah, who her whole life and her culture has desired to have a child, to experience that, to carry on the line, that responsibility, to be a part of that promise which the Lord made to the first woman, saying that through the seed of the woman that someday the one would come who would bring victory, who would overcome. Before it was impossible, so the laugh is a laugh of mockery, of disbelief. Now the laughter is the laughter of joy. When the Lord's promise becomes reality, that which was impossible becomes possible, and that which was a laughter of derision becomes a laughter of joy. How much do we see that in our own lives when the promises of God are brought forth in our lives through the finished work of Jesus Christ? That which was mourning becomes laughter. That which was impossible becomes possible. And that's what we see the Lord revealing here in the story of Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Imagine for Abraham at this moment. Before, God had told him the importance of the covenant of circumcision, of this physical symbol in their flesh, of the promise God had made from generation to generation. And Abraham had himself circumcised and his house circumcised. But now here he is, and performing the rite on his son, the son who was impossible. Now, I'm sure at this moment, as Abraham is performing the rite of circumcision on his 8-day-old son, all of a sudden that promise now looks like reality. What a celebration. But then we continue. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. You can hear her almost laughing herself, probably hysterical. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And this is laughter of joy, somewhat of disbelief. Some people may hear it as the word travels to relations and such, going, oh, come on now. That's not even possible. But when they hear that it's true, how awesome this is, that God fulfilled his promise. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Who would have said to him, oh yeah, your wife can have children? And yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Then we come to an interesting other part of this chapter. Something that also shows God's faithfulness to his promise. Not just to the promise that he's made to Abraham, but to another promise he made. So let's continue. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Suddenly we come to, right on the heels of so much happiness, we come to this hard moment. We see that time has passed. Isaac is growing older, and it's reaching the point where he's being weaned, which it's difficult for us to determine a time frame here, but in all likelihood, looking at customs of the time, Isaac could have been even 3 or 4 years old by the time he was weaned. So a period of time has passed. We have a feast, a celebration, and at that feast, we are told that Sarah perceives that Ishmael is mocking Isaac. That something has taken place, and as far as Sarah is concerned, Sarah views Ishmael and Hagar as enemies. Not only does she view them as enemies, but the thought that in some way Ishmael will be joint heirs with Isaac infuriates her. And think about it, back before when it was Sarah's idea to have Hagar produce offspring for Abraham, that seemed like a good thing. Now she is against it. Now that this other heir is here and she has produced a son, Sarah has produced a son, her desire to have him share anything with Ishmael is offensive to her. So she goes to Abraham and says that Abraham has to get rid of Ishmael and Hagar. And we see something again of the growing character of Abraham, because when Sarah comes to him and says, look, you've got to get rid of this boy, you've got to get rid of this woman, they're not going to share in any way in the inheritance, they're not going to be heirs with Isaac, get rid of them. Abraham at first grieves. This troubles him. This concerns him. I think looking specifically at the wording here, let's use the word used in this particular translation. It says that he was displeased. Because after all, Ishmael is a son of his. Ishmael is part of him, and he is part of his household. So this troubles him, but he's calm because he has his wife saying, Isaac is the one now. Ishmael is in competition with him. He should not be here. And so he's displeased by this. But the Lord speaks to Abraham and says, it's okay. It is true. Isaac is the son of promise. That is true, but God reminds Abraham that he has also made a promise to Ishmael. He said, I've made a promise to Ishmael. And I will honor that promise. And if you were with us in the previous chapter, shortly after Hagar had Ishmael, the first time Sarah turns against her and Hagar flees from Sarah because of Sarah's harsh treatment, the Lord meets her and he makes the promise to her. He tells her that Ishmael will have a great future. So the Lord reminds Abraham of this and says, it's okay. You can let her go. And so off she goes. We come to verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about a distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. So we have this really powerful picture, because Hagar enters into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, all she expects is death. All she expects is death. Death first to come to her child. She has no more water, she has nothing, so she expects that her son, who is now grown weary, she says, you rest here. Rest under this bush. There's some shade there, and she goes off. But she goes off because said, I can't watch my son die. We're both going to die out here. I can't watch him die. And she weeps. In verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God came to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. We have the angel of God as it appeared the first time when she was in the wilderness, when she went off thinking that it would lead to destruction, when she was fleeing from Sarah with nowhere to go. And the angel of the Lord met her in the wilderness. He meets her again. I have heard the voice of the boy. Now go to him. Don't hide your face from him expecting him to die. Go to him, because I made a promise. I will make him into a great nation. This is the Lord reminding Hagar of the promise. Remember when your child was but a baby and you were out in the wilderness. Do you remember that, Hagar? Years have passed, but do you remember that time? I met you in the wilderness and I made you a promise. I haven't forgot the promise. I hear the boy. I haven't forgot the promise. I hear the boy. So you go to him, because he's not going to die under that bush. You know why he can't die under that bush? Because I made him a promise. He is going to be a great nation. And then we see the Lord's provision. Verse 19, then God opened her eyes. I love that. God opened her eyes to actually see what she hadn't seen before. And she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. What a powerful picture we see here. And the Lord keeps his promises. He kept the big promise. He also keeps other promises. There is no promise the Lord makes that he does not keep. There is no promise the Lord makes that he does not keep. So as we read the Word of God and we see the promises that are offered to us today, the Lord will keep them. He will not keep one and renege on another. He had made a promise to Abraham. He'd made a promise of who Isaac would be. He made a promise to Hagar of who Ishmael would be. And the Lord keeps his promises. The chapter ends with an encounter with Abraham and Abimelech again. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. See, Abimelech knows that the Lord has made a special covenant, a promise to Abraham. And so Abimelech is saying, for the sake of my people in this land, Abram, can you promise me that you will deal honestly with me? Because I know the Lord has you here. I know you're sojourning here. I know He's protecting you here. Will you promise that you will deal honestly with me? And Abraham says, I will swear. And then we see that an issue comes up. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Now, in all likelihood, this would have been the kind of covenant that was probably a covenant of blood. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore the place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So we see how Abraham enters into a covenant based on the kind of covenant that God has entered into him. And Abraham is being called, be faithful, be righteous. Abraham, deal with me. Abimelech is basically saying, Abraham, deal with me as your God deals with you. And so Abraham does. He makes a blood covenant with Abimelech and how they will act. An issue comes up and they deal with the issue together. Abraham is acting as an ambassador for the Lord. This is something that the Lord said Abraham would be, that he would represent him, that people would look to him. This was one of the things that the Lord said about Abraham, and we see it being acted out as Abimelech deals with Abraham. Abraham, deal with me the way the Lord deals with you. And Abraham does. Abraham is testifying to the character of God to the people round about him. And then I want you to notice the last thing in this chapter, and there was a lot in it. We see this point where it says that Abraham called upon the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. This is important that we see God being revealed as the everlasting God, because this ties back to the promise. If God is temporary, then only the immediate promises can we trust in. But if God is the everlasting God, the one who always continues, the one who does not change, then the promises for today hold, but so do the promises for the generations to come. Because remember, the Lord told Abraham, 400 years from now, this is what's going to happen. Your people will go into Egypt. They will be in Egypt, and I will bring them out of Egypt by my mighty hand, and I will bring them to the land that I have promised you now, and it will become their possession. If he is the everlasting God, then a promise in the future is just as trustworthy as the promise of today. And Abraham is growing in that understanding, that the promises of the future are just as trustworthy as the promises today. And the same with us. If you know Jesus Christ, if you've put your trust in him and believed on his name, then the promises he gives you to sustain you today are trustworthy. The same as the promises he gave you yesterday are trustworthy. The same as the promises for your future are trustworthy. We've been told that all the sins that we have committed, that he has paid for, and they're gone. Past, present, and future, if we believed in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. So I don't have to worry about what is happening down the road. I don't have to worry about someday in the future when I will stand before the Lord, because the promise he has made me is true. And he is everlasting. His promises don't fade, and they don't change. I hope this is an encouragement to you. We'd love to hear any feedback that you have. And as always, if this has encouraged you or challenged you, and you think it would benefit someone else, please share it with them as well. Thank you, and God bless you.